Okay. You guys have had metabolism before, right? Y'all do metabolism in human, like in human phys, right? If I say the Krebs cycle, you understand what that is. The electron transport chain. You guys have heard of something called creatine phosphate, maybe, right? It's not just, right, the supplement that your boyfriend takes or something in the midst of all of this, okay? So I don't know how to break this to you guys in a difficult way. So I'm just gonna be honest about it. Okay. The way that you guys have been taught metabolism up until now is a lie. Okay. And I'm asking, what? And that's, I'm being a little bit hyperbolic when I say all of that. Okay. But what we're going to do that's going to make this, I think, probably the conceptually most difficult thing that we cover in all of class is a very simple idea, but it's so counter to how all of this material has been presented to you guys up until now into your life that I think it's going to make your brain hurt. Okay. So let me show you a thing, and then I'm going to make a statement, and I'm going to try to explain sort of what that means. And then we'll get into basically sort of what the lie is and how it's sort of partially a lie. Okay. All right. All metabolism is, okay, is energy. It's making energy. Okay. If we imagine in a muscle cell, you have some ATP that is just floating around inside of your muscle cell. Okay. When we do contractions, so when we exercise, right, when you're walking to the refrigerator, whatever you're doing, when we do contractions, we are going to take that ATP and in various processes that we've already discussed, convert it into ADP. Okay. So you do a muscle contraction, right? The myosin ATPase breaks ATP down to tell the cross bridges to let go. Circa uses ATP to pull calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The sodium potassium pump uses ATP to repolarize T-tubules and the sarcolemma and axons and the motor neurons, and then you're using it in your brain as well. Okay. So when we do muscle contractions, we break ATP down. That's metabolism. Okay. That's metabolism. How much ATP do you think you have in your muscles? This is always a fun question. How much do you think you have? How many contractions worth of ATP to do this do you think you have floating around in a muscle fiber?
What size?
Pardon?
What size?
What size contraction? Maybe it's the wrong question to ask, man. Should you maybe be asking what type of contraction? You by size, you mean like how much force? Yeah, okay. I don't know, a maximal. 1, 2, 10. 2, max?
Is that like a guesstimation type thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just a guess. I stand here, how many contractions, how many curls can I do before all the ATP in the fibers in my bicep is gone? Probably 1, maybe 2. Okay, it all depends. But very, very little. You have a tiny amount of ATP floating around in your muscles. A tiny amount. Okay. And this is why understanding metabolism is so hard. Because, right, I'm awake all day. I'm using ATP all day. I can walk. My wife walked 10 miles yesterday doing her half marathon training. Okay. You think I got 1 contraction's worth and she took, I don't know, like 25,000 steps or something crazy. Okay. We have a tiny amount of ATP in your muscles. Why? Your muscle fibers are small. There's physically not space for them. Okay. So. What I have on the screen here, what I have written here is the real key to metabolism. You break ATP down. I don't have that much. So I'm going to use what we think of as these traditional metabolic pathways that you guys have been taught about to turn that ADP back into ATP. Okay. Think of a muscle cell as essentially having a pool of adenosine, the A on the ATP. It has a pool of adenosine in it. And that pool is constant. And what we're doing basically is we're just cycling from here to here and back, and here to here and back. So as this gets broken down, we use one of our metabolic pathways to put a phosphate back on ADP or to put two phosphates on AMP and make ATP back again. Okay. So there's just this constant flux that's going on. Okay. You guys with me so far? Here's the lie. Okay. Here's the lie. Very likely, what you guys have been taught about the metabolic pathways, you've been taught the pathways. You've been taught how much ATP you get from the pathway. You've likely even been taught in what instances is a pathway likely to be the predominant place that we're going to get ATP from. And that stuff's not wrong. Okay. But when we think about it in this context, I want you guys to think sort of four-dimensionally here. The body gives 0 fucks where the extra ATP comes from. We're going from here to here. All your muscle knows is I need to make more ATP. I need it back so I can run away from that saber-toothed tiger. Okay? I need it back so I can repolarize and my brain can keep firing. It doesn't matter. And so because of that, okay, any place here that produces ATP is fine. Any of those places are fine to get ATP from. And so because of that, all metabolic pathways are operating all the time. There is no discrete, we do this, and then we switch to this, and then we switch to this, and then we switch to this, and then we flip the substrate. No. They're all active all the time. Okay. And that's the big lie, because it's hard for us to teach you guys about those things without learning the pathways, that they're all going all the time. Okay. Every one of these metabolic pathways has a finite capacity to turn ADP back into ATP. And it has a speed or a velocity at which it can do it, which is governed by a number of things that we will get into. And so right now, as you guys sit there, you're deriving ADP back to ATP to write and just be alive from all of these pathways, but most of it is coming from the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, because turnover is slow and it can be matched by this. Okay. So when you start exercising, you stand up, you walk, you jog, you run, you sprint, this goes faster and faster and turns over more and more. We may have to shift around where we're getting it from, even though they're all giving us a little bit all the time. Okay. I promise you that will be a question on the test. All metabolic pathways are active all the time. Okay. So with this as the context, we will jump in a little bit on talking about some of the basics of ATP, some of the basics of our metabolic substrates, and then we'll get into a little bit of the early pathways, okay, the more simple pathways as we start to go along today. Okay, what is happening? Okay. So metabolism at its most basic is deriving chemical energy. It's putting a phosphate back onto ADP. It's making ATP from the breakdown of what we call a substrate. Okay. The things that you eat are substrates. Substrates fall into several general categories. Carbohydrates, any kind of sugar. Fat, glycerol, free fatty acids, any kind of lipid content stuff. And then protein. Mostly we'll take the proteins and we'll break them down into their individual amino acids. A lot of it gets sent to your liver and converted back into glucose. But we can, if we get really, really desperate, actually try to start sticking amino acids into the Krebs cycle. Okay. All right. So before this is freaking me out. So I apologize, guys. Let me do one thing. Back out of this and try to do it this way. There we go. That makes me much happier. Now my screen here matches. Okay. Why should we care about metabolism as it relates to exercise? Okay. Our physiological responses. Okay. When you have greater ATP turnover, breathing goes up, heart rate, stroke volume go up, so cardiac output goes up. Okay. You release certain hormones, you release certain neurotransmitters. So many of the changes that take place during a bout of exercise in our physiology occur as a result of the change in metabolism. Okay. We need to change processes to help support all of this ATP turnover. We'll talk more about that as we go along. Because of that, many training adaptations occur in direct proportion to the ATP turnover that takes place during a bout of exercise. If the ATP turnover drives these other changes, those changes disrupt homeostasis, and then we want to adapt, try to have less of a change the next time. Okay, so understanding what a bout of exercise does from a metabolic standpoint can help us predict training adaptations and better design programs. If you care about exercise and exercise performance, in many instances, exercise performance is limited by how fast and to what capacity we can manage to turn ADP back into ATP. Okay. Especially during short-term high-intensity exercise, when ATP to ADP turnover is very, very high and very, very fast. Okay. Metabolism can limit that because it cannot keep up. And conversely, or I don't know, it would be hypocritically or ironically, during very long events, very long duration things, where ATP turnover is not that high, but it goes on for a very, very, very long time, the process can actually begin to kind of get. Okay. So when we think of this, we think of a concept called fatigue, which is an inability to produce force. You cannot produce force because we can't do these things. We do not have ATP to break actin and myosin, to pull calcium back in, or to repolarize. So fatigue can be caused by a decreased availability of energy or accumulation of certain things that actually inhibit our pathways, which shut down this ability to do that. We'll talk a lot about that next week. Okay. You guys with me so far? Okay. Very good. Okay. So energy is defined as the ability to perform work. Work is force times distance. Okay. You want to do it from a physics standpoint. And we want to really get into the bioenergetics and the sort of kind of high order thinking of things. We want to think about the first law of thermodynamics. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it transforms from one form to another without being depleted. So what that means basically, and don't worry about total energy is equal to potential energy plus kinetic energy. Don't worry about that. But think about the first law of thermodynamics. That's what this is, okay? We're neither creating nor destroying energy, we're just shifting it, right? I shift the energy into these enzymes, and then I shift it from some substrate back into ATP, right? I eat something, I do something, and I store it up here, and then I shift the energy out of that food back into ATP, and then I shift it over here into these enzymes so I can actually generate muscle contractions and perform work. So all we're really doing, okay, is we're just moving phosphates around. That's all we're doing. Okay? That's all we're doing. That's this idea of the first law of thermodynamics. Okay? So we've talked about ATP. I'm going to spend very little time on all of this. Okay. Generally, right, ATP is our primary way that we store and transfer energy in the body. Okay. There's some things, there's something called GTP, there's some other stuff that's going to go on, but this is the primary one. As it relates to exercise, ATP use, the amount of ATP converted to ADP, okay, in a given amount of time tells us exercise intensity. Okay. If I am walking and my exercise intensity is low, it means that my ATP turnover is relatively low. If I jog and intensity goes up, then ATP turnover has gone up. If I sprint and it goes up even more, we do that. Okay. The rate of ATP use in a contraction varies with fiber type. Why? Why does it vary with fiber type?
Speed.
Speed, okay. What about it with that speed?
Fastest switch.
Yep. What makes it fast or slow twitch?
The ability to replenish the using circuit.
That's right. So I break it fast with this, okay? Remember, myosin ATPase and circa speed and their efficiency varies with fiber type. Okay? And so because they vary and they are more active in the fast twitch fibers, we use more ATP in a fast twitch fiber. So it all comes back to these things. It's all going to be linked. Okay? And so, as I said, ATP stored in the cells very low. We replenish it using our pathways that we're going to learn about. And this is the part that is so nuanced and that makes this difficult. Okay. We use all the pathways all the time, but the pathway that predominates. What does something mean when it predominates? Anybody know? First choice, okay. Maybe Mallory, maybe a little more nuance even in all of that. If we don't have a first choice, if something predominates, you've got three things that are going on, but one of those three predominates. What does that tell us about that one compared to the other two? It's being used more. Good, okay. In most instances, there will be a predominant energy pathway at a given moment in time, right? And which of these pathways that is going to vary based upon, are you running, are you biking, are you walking, what's going on? It's really key on the intensity of exercise. It is somewhat dependent upon the presence or lack of oxygen, although to be really honest, it's rare when you don't have oxygen. Okay. Your state of training plays a big role, and then like your diet also plays a big role about which pathway, and are we using carbs, are we using fat? And we'll get into all of this, but this is why this gets to be a little bit tricky. Okay, this is why this gets to be a little tricky. Quick run through of our energy substrates. I know you guys have had nutrition. I know you guys have probably talked about all of this before, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page. Okay. Carbohydrates, sugar, okay, glucose, fructose, galactose, sucrose, pick it out, whatever you want to say. Okay. we're going to talk about glucose as our model carbohydrate. So when we say what's going to go through glycolysis and then through the Krebs cycle and all of this, we're going to say a molecule of glucose goes in, okay? We do a lot of things in the body where we'll take other carbs and turn them into glucose in that way. We store carbohydrates in your body as glycogen. Glycogen is just a big collection of glucose all hooked together. You store it in your liver and you store it in your muscles. It's very important that we do both. And we use those two stores for different things in a lot of instances that have really, really key implications, especially for endurance exercise that we'll cover probably Friday. Okay. You have fat that is stored in the body or lipid that is in the body. Most of what we mean here is adipose tissue. Okay. Free fatty acids that are stored or put together into adipose tissue. Subcutaneous adipose tissue. All right. Visceral adipose tissue that is here in and around sort of the abdominal region. You have fat or lipid molecules stored inside your muscle fibers. Okay. And we'll talk about those. When you eat something that has fat in it, right? You went and had a Chick-fil-A chicken biscuit this morning. Sounds awesome, right? That will be broken down and there will be free fatty acids that will then appear in your blood. You will use some of them to make energy, and then some of it may go on and get stored. Okay. We store in our adipose tissue way more energy in fat. Okay, way more. Right? Orders of magnitude more. Well, I won't say everybody. Many of us, me included, very much so, have weeks worth of energy stored as adipose tissue in our bodies. Okay. We don't have carbs to last more than maybe a day, thereabouts, if you were to use all of them. Okay. So those kinds of things. Protein, we don't use protein as a metabolic substrate very often, but think about proteins, think about their component parts like amino acids. We very often convert them into glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis at the liver. We'll talk about that in a couple of slides. Okay, we can use them directly. Generally, the body does not like to use proteins or break down protein to turn it into glucose unless you are in a caloric deficit, unless you really desperately need this, okay? Because we use the protein to have muscle, and we need the muscle to hunt and gather and do all the other things evolutionarily that we thought might be a reasonable thing. Okay. Okay. Let's talk about a bunch of words, start with G and sound the same, and try to make sense of all of this alphabet soup. Okay. So these are all going to have something to do with carbohydrates. Okay. Because they start with gly, right? We have glycolysis, which is a metabolic pathway that technically is the breakdown of glucose to ATP and lactic acid. Okay. Oh, if it only it was that fucking simple. Okay. That's glycolysis. Glycogenesis, in many ways, is not exactly the opposite, but it's making glycogen from multiple molecules of glucose. Okay. Glycogenolysis is breaking glycogen down. Back from glycogen back into its component glucose molecules. There's an enzyme that does this, and it's called phosphorylase. And we'll talk a little bit more about phosphorylase probably on the way in a second. Then there is gluconeogenesis, which is making glucose from a non-glucose precursor, very often amino acids from protein. Okay, and this is done at the liver. Okay, this is done at the liver. And this is why you can eat a carnivore diet and never have any carbs. And if we measure your blood glucose, you're still going to have glucose in your blood, even though you don't eat any. It's because you're taking all of that bacon and other things that you're eating and you're converting it into glucose in the liver. Okay. Brain runs on glucose. You've got to have a way to convert other energy substrates. All right. So those are our G words that are going to be there. This is just some math illustrating our stores. And this is a 12% body fat person who weighs 143 pounds. I don't know why the book thinks that that is not typical of like literally anyone in the US in the year 2024. But this person has about 1,500 calories of stored energy in carbs and about 72,000 in fat. And they don't have very much fat. If you're looking at that. So you've got maybe a day, maybe 2 days if you were in a coma's worth of carbohydrate, and then weeks in fat. Okay? This will become important during endurance exercise. How much energy do we have stored as fat? How much do we have stored as carbohydrate? So what I can tell you guys is that when this is gone, when the carbohydrate store is gone, even though we have a shit ton here, doesn't matter, bad things begin to happen in the body when carbohydrate stores get depleted, okay? Your body will want to shut down. Your brain will say, we don't like this. We don't like this. We run on carbs. We're low on carbs. Shut it down, okay? Shut it down. So that can be a problem we're gonna have to interact with, okay? Okay, now, I've written these pathways on the board. You've learned about all of these pathways before as well, okay? I'm going to tell you how the book kind of classifies them. I don't make a big fuss about, is it an immediate, is it a phosphagen, is it non-oxidative, is it oxidative in the midst of this, but this is kind of the traditional naming conventions, okay? We have what we call these phosphagen energy systems. And they're called phosphagen because we're going to directly make ATP from them, or we're going to directly pull a phosphate off of something. The key thing to remember about the phosphagen systems, okay, are they're fast. They're very, very fast. And that has implications for when we use them. Okay? And we'll talk about why they're fast in a minute. But they're fast. They are anaerobic. So they do not use oxygen at any point in the midst of this. There's no oxygen used. Okay? And they all occur in the cytoplasm. So these are things that are just floating around in the cytoplasm of a muscle cell. Okay? And that's very, very, okay, that's very. Why are they fast? Anyone want to guess? Why are they fast? Okay. Great guess, Nathan, but it's not quite correct. It's not quite correct. Okay. Let's do a fun experiment. Okay. Here's what we need to do. Okay. Melinda, you have take a little piece, take a spare piece of paper and write your favorite color on it. Okay. I want you, okay. What we're gonna need to figure out now is we're gonna have a race between Emily, who's sitting next to her, and I don't know, we'll pick someone else back in the back. We'll go, Landry has her thing out, we'll try to go to there, okay? So it's okay. You guys need to know what her favorite color is. And you're only gonna get it, right, by her passing that note to you. All right. So I'm going to pass the note to Emily. Okay, you see it, you know? Okay. Very quick. Now, pass it back to Lanny. So we gotta wait. Imagine we had two things, and we had to do both. I should have done two. My analysis has been terrible. Just it's okay, just hand it to people, make them pass it. Okay, we're going, we're still going, we're still going. Okay, Emily, what was her favorite color? Green, Landry, it's still green, right? Okay. The note is, the color is our ATP. We've made it back to here. Why did it get to Emily first? Okay, she was closer. Good. And how many sort of intermediate things do we have to go through to get it to Emily? 0, 1, we handed it right to her. Okay. What about to get back here to Landry? How many of the rest of you touched that piece of paper? Right? I don't know, there were 4 or 5 of y'all. Okay. Now imagine it was 20. Okay. Why are phosphagen systems faster? Because they're one step. You go from these things right to ADP. Boom, here. Hand it right to it. Hand that phosphate over right now. Our other pathways, we've got to go ding, 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 and move through a whole bunch of steps. And then we got it to Landry. Now Landry's got to get it into a mitochondria and hand it over here to Samantha, who then has to pass it down to 25 other people. And we look up and we're like, oh, okay, we finally got that, right? That's why phosphagen systems are called immediate. That's why they're fast. They are simple one-step reactions. Okay, simple one-step reactions. Okay. We have one, what we're going to call sort of a non-oxidative pathway, which I think is a terrible way to describe it. Okay. But we call it the glycolytic pathway. All right. Glycolysis, and we'll get into this in a couple of slides. Glycolysis is anaerobic. I'm going to show you a slide and I'm going to call it non-oxidative glycolysis or aerobic and anaerobic glycolysis, and it's all wrong. Glycolysis is anaerobic. You do not use oxygen anywhere in glycolysis ever. Okay. Glycolysis also occurs in the cytoplasm. Okay. But it's slower because it has, I don't know, 12 or 13 steps. Okay. We got to make some energy while we break some things down. We get more energy than we do from our immediate. But it occurs in the cytoplasm. That's also really important. Okay. Our oxidative pathways or the aerobic metabolic pathways, I will generally refer to the aerobic metabolic pathways. And what I mean from that are the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain sort of collectively together. That's my shorthand. Okay. It's Krebs and the electron transport chain. Even though technically we make ATP in both of those, it's kind of hard to get one without the other. So I'm going to refer to them collectively. The oxidative pathways occur in the mitochondria. This is a key step. They occur in the mitochondria and they have to have oxygen at the very end or the pathway doesn't work. Okay? Or the pathway doesn't work. Okay. You guys with me so far? Okay. With me so far. Good. All right, so let's talk about and try to look at, and I apologize, this is kind of putting the cart before the horse type of thing. But what you see here is a graph that I really like, okay? And I want to start you guys with this, like I've started you with this over here, and then we'll talk about the individual pathways, and then we'll revisit this. But I like to show it to you to start with, because I think it sets kind of the big picture of what we're seeing. What you see here, okay, is a graph attempting to depict the percentage of all of the ATP being made, okay, all of this turnover that is happening, that is coming from each of those kind of collective groups of metabolic pathways, from the phosphagen systems, from glycolysis, and from the Krebs cycle and your aerobic pathways. Okay, this is relative energy coming from each one of those. Okay, imagine from this that we are doing a fairly brisk job. Okay, this is something that you could do constantly for about 5 minutes to 10 minutes. If you can do it for 5, you can do it for 2 hours. Okay, that's a whole separate advanced exercise phys day that we won't have time to talk about. But if you can do it at that pace for 5, you can run the rest of the marathon at that pace. Okay. Some interesting things about it. So you're doing a brisk jog. Okay. What you guys are seeing is kind of where we are. This is the relative percentage of all the ATP turnover. So in the first, say, 10 seconds of exercise, right? You're going from rest to I start to jog. We're almost exclusively getting energy from those immediate phosphagen pathways. But look what happens over about 30 seconds. It falls, okay? So in the first, say, 10, 15, maybe up to about 30 seconds of exercise, the predominant energy pathway is the phosphagen system. Now, this is not an all-out sprint. If it's an all-out sprint, it wouldn't even be 30 seconds, okay? But the predominant pathway is the phosphagen. As they fall off, you will note that glycolysis and the aerobic pathways are sort of doing the inverse thing. These are going down, these are going up, okay? So within the first minute or so, we're going to go from basically all coming from the immediate pathways from the phosphagens to very large contributions from glycolysis for, say, the first minute to 90 seconds. We're going to get out here after a couple of minutes and glycolysis is going to begin to fall. Okay. And then the aerobic pathways are going to get ramped up and are going to begin to be the predominant pathway. So at this submaximal exercise, we're going to see the first couple of minutes that are going to be phosphagen and glycolytic heavy, and then aerobic begins to take over. Remember that I told you guys that the muscles don't care where the ATP comes from. All they care about is that we need this much to do what we're doing. Get it to us from wherever. Okay. So this is how this looks. Okay. And so when we revisit this at the end, we'll add in a couple of things about, okay, well, what if this was an all-out sprint, right? And I get to a place where I've used up all my immediate pathways, what has to happen? I gotta slow down, right? That I need a certain amount of ATP to go at a certain pace, and I gotta have a collection of all of this that gets it to. This is kind of the general thing. How many of you, if you ever go and you run or you bike or you walk and you do things and you don't warm up like me, because warm-ups are dumb, and you feel pretty crappy for the first 3 or 4 minutes while you're running, and then you actually start to feel a little bit better, right? It feels worse right at the start. Even though you're going the same speed, you're on the same level ground, like whatever, it's a normal thing. The reason the first part feels crappy is because you've used up your immediate systems, you're making excess lactic acid at the start because you're predominantly doing glycolysis, and then once that can kind of back off and you can get the aerobic pathways, and you begin to feel better, okay? Your perceptions of what happens during exercise are directly tied to what's going on from a metabolic pathway standpoint. And for most of us, doing a warm-up is stupid. It doesn't do any good, okay? But if you really care about how you feel in that first little bit, you do a warm-up and you can get aerobic ramped up to start with. So it's going to be contributing a larger percentage sooner. And that can be some of the utility of that. Okay. All right. Let's talk about a couple of our immediate pathways, and then we'll get out of here today. Okay. So the first one, okay, I guess I really should start with stored ATP. Okay. It's not on here, but you have a certain amount of ATP in your muscle. That's the first thing that we use. Okay. That's the first thing that gets used. But it's a tiny amount, like one contraction, boom, you're done. ATP is gone. Okay. Once that begins to happen, the next sort of predominant energy pathway is in the form of what we call the creatine phosphate pathway. This one is next because it's very, very fast. Okay, it's very fast. You have in your muscles floating around molecules of creatine that we have hooked a single phosphate onto, and they just float around. Okay. You get that creatine in your muscles from creatine that you have eaten in your diet or creatine that you have taken as a supplement. Okay. So if you are a low protein consumer, you might have less creatine in your muscles, which could have some metabolic implications. Okay. Most of our creatine, right, in the body is located in the skeletal muscle. We do know in about 80% of the population who are responders, if we give you more protein or we give you more creatine as a supplement, you can increase the amount of creatine and therefore the amount of creatine phosphate in your muscles by about 20%. Okay. So for a majority of you guys, if you take extra creatine, you'll have more creatine phosphate in your muscles, and that could, in some circumstances, metabolically be helpful. Okay? Metabolically, it could be helpful. We have a huge amount of research on this. Strangely, creatine is not anabolic. Most people that take creatine are taking it because they think it's going to help them make their muscles get bigger. But creatine by itself doesn't do anything. It's not anabolic. Okay? Otherwise, you just eat tuna fish all day. Loading protocols, if you eat 2 cans of tuna fish every day, that's the same amount of creatine that you get from taking the supplement. Okay. Personally, I'll take the supplement. So not really my thing, but everybody else, you can do what you like. Okay. So the biochemical equation looks like what's in the middle. You have creatine phosphate. When creatine phosphate and an enzyme called creatine kinase come into contact with ADP, which becomes more likely when ATP gets broken down to ADP. So ADP levels rise, that drives that reaction to the right. We pull the phosphate off of creatine, stick it onto ADP, and we make ATP, and then you have free creatine floating around in your muscle. Okay. This is our fastest method of providing energy. Okay. It tends to be the initial predominant pathway that's used because it's so fast. Problem is that we have a very, very, very limited amount of creatine phosphate in your muscles. Your muscle fibers are only so big. You can only put a certain amount of creatine in there. Okay. So it's limited. Generally, you have enough creatine phosphate for very, very high intensity exercise to last maybe 8 to 15 or 20 seconds. Okay. You have enough creatine phosphate if you are an elite Olympic sprinter to run 200 meters. Okay. 2 football fields. That's about it. Okay. Any of you guys taken exercise physiology lab with Andrea or Dr. Pereira? Do you guys do a Wingate test in there? Yeah. Okay. Any of you guys the person doing the Wingate? No. Do you remember what it looked like? You do the Wingate. You get on a bike. It's the most terrible test in the entire world. It's glorious. Okay. We get you on a bike. We give you a resistance. It's 80% of your body weight. And we say, pedal as fast as you can. Then we put the weight, the resistance on, and you got to go for 30 seconds. As hard as you can go for 30 seconds. And if you graph the power output, they start off up here and it goes, and then it kind of levels off on the back. You can watch as it goes down. You can watch creatine phosphate being depleted. They're doing great. They're doing great. They get to about 8 or 10 seconds and it falls off. And they get to about 15 or 20 and they're just done. And then you get off the bike and you want to throw up. It's awesome. So it's awesome. We stopped doing them when I was a grad student at Georgia. We stopped doing them in one of the classes because we would do them and people would always pass out afterwards. Right? You wouldn't think like it's just an all-out 30-second sprint, but you think I can do a 30-second sprint, it'll be fine. People pass out. Somebody like fainted and the person didn't catch them and they bashed their head on the water fountain. We had to call 911. So we're like, all right, we're going to stop doing this in these ways. Although to be honest, it was, we were doing all the protocols and the person that was meant to catch them didn't catch them. That's what I tell myself, right? We weren't being that negligent. So, but that is because you use up your creatine phosphate. Okay. It lasts about that long. So you can envision a scenario, right, where I supplement creatine, I now have more creatine phosphate in my muscle, and so now I can do a heavy sprint not for 20 seconds, but for 22 or 23 seconds. So tell me, critical thinkers that you all are, how does that translate into hypertrophy with resistance training? Because I can tell you, we have as much data on supplementing with creatine phosphate or supplementing with creatine, getting us a little bit of extra hypertrophy. It's on the order of like the caffeine research. Okay. It's a little bit, but it's very, very consistent if you're a person who responds. So how? How does doing this, and I can go for a couple more seconds, how might that get me more hypertrophy? Okay. You're right, Victor, but how does high intensity give me more hypertrophy? I need to add this as a text question. How?
Does it have anything to do with how quickly it replenishes?
Not exactly. If I want to replenish it quickly, I actually need to go be aerobically trained because you don't replenish until you've stopped. But you're sort of on the right track.
Higher intensity, making more muscle damage.
Maybe, but higher intensity how? How am I getting, how can I translate a little bit of extra short-term immediate energy into doing more when I resistance train? Which might give me more damage, which might lead to greater activation of mTOR and all of those things.
So you do like one more contraction.
Yes, yes, yes. Perfect. You saved everybody from having homework. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, supplementing creatine isn't anabolic by itself. It's a training. Potentially by having more, I can do one more rep, or I can do one more rep at a little bit higher weight, a little higher intensity, which is what Victor's getting at. And so maybe that then lets me disrupt the membrane a little bit more, activate mTOR a little bit more, and that gets me that thing. Landon's idea about recovery and all of that is also fascinating. We can talk about that later on. Okay. I will see you guys on Wednesday.